All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Yuval Levin. I'm Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies here at AEI and Editor of National Affairs. And we're here this morning to talk about the state of our political culture and what we might do to improve it some in this complicated time. It's a subject that, of course, is intrinsically important and interesting, and understanding it is really essential to understanding the condition of American political and civic life today. But it's also a subject that's of particular importance to us in this moment here at the American Enterprise Institute. AEI is a public policy research institution, but we're living in a time when our politics has just amazingly little to do with public policy. Very little of what happens in the political arena now seems to have much to do with concrete policy questions. Even when people seem to talk in the language of policy, they're very often just deploying signals and slogans, tokens in a bitter and divisive cultural conflict. And most of the time, there's not even really the pretense of a kind of policy language, but just open cultural warfare in our politics. That means that a lot of the work we do here, the work of formulating policy ideas, has a very hard time breaking through now. And for it to matter, we have to understand what it is that it has to break through and how that might be done. And that compels us to take up some questions of political culture, political psychology, and sociology, and ultimately to grasp something of the character of contemporary polarization. It's an enormously complicated and confusing problem, and so we've asked for some help in taking it up this morning. We have with us two of the most creative and sophisticated thinkers on this set of questions to help us work through them. Jonathan Rauch, who we'll hear from first, is a senior fellow in governing studies at the Brookings Institution. He's the author of 6 books and countless essays and articles on public policy, culture, and government. He's a contributing editor at The Atlantic and has written brilliantly since the beginning of this century in particular on the decay of our political culture and the emergence of a new kind of polarization. Arnold Kling is an affiliated scholar at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. He's an economist by training, but he is a polymath who has made contributions to a very wide variety of fields. Particularly important for our purposes here, he is the author of The 3 Languages of Politics, a brilliant analysis of the patterns of contemporary political rhetoric. Both of them have been published very widely on the questions that we'll take up, maybe most notably, I have to say, in National Affairs, but very widely published on these subjects. Our format is very simple. Jonathan and Arnold will each speak for 15 to 20 minutes or so. The 3 of us will then take up some of the issues that they raise in conversation, and then we'll bring all of you into that conversation with some Q&A. Our aim is modest, but I think profound. It is simply to understand the condition of our country's civic and political life a little bit better by the time we're done this morning. So let's begin by welcoming Jonathan Rauch.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. It's so nice to see so many friends in the room. I think I almost know everybody here, and it's also a privilege to be back at AEI, where 30 years ago I launched what I think is still my best book here as a guest scholar. I'd like to talk a bit about what I think of as rethinking polarization, the subject of an article that I wrote for National Affairs, Yuval's magazine, which you might have a look at. But I thought I'd lay a little groundwork by just trying a quick experiment here in the room. I'm going to show you a couple of optical illusions. Now, some of you will be familiar with one or both of these optical illusions. If you are, that's fine. Just please don't turn to your neighbor and say, here's the right answer. You may have seen both of these. I'm going to ask first the panel and then the audience to evaluate both of these diagrams. The first one, the horizontal one on top, here is the question. The question's going to be which segment of the horizontal line by itself in the upper drawing is longer, segment A, segment B, or neither. So Arnold and Yuval, which is the longer segment? Raise your hand if you think it's A. Raise your hand if you think it's B. And raise your hand if you think it's neither. Okay. Panel, again, second optical illusion. Your target line is the line on the left. Your job is to match it with one of the lines on the right, A, B, or C. Raise your hand if you think that target line 1 is best matched by line A. Raise your hand if you think it's best matched by line B. And raise your hand if you think it's best matched by line C. Okay? Same question to the audience. Raise your hand on the upper diagram, the horizontal line. Which is longer, A, B, or neither? Raise your hand if you think it's A. Can everyone look around and see that? Let's get both joints up so everyone can see it, okay? That's about 7 or 8 people. Raise your hand if you think it's B. That's one person. Raise your hand if you think it's neither. That's a majority. I think someone raised 2 hands. Second diagram. Raise your hand if you think the closest match to line 1 is A. Raise your hand. We've got 1 for A. Raise your hand if you think it's B. No takers for B. Raise your hand if you think it's C. Okay. A question which I won't ask but will be curious about is how many of you know what's really going on here? But we will circle back to the relevance of the little demonstration that we just did. Partisan ideological polarization is a real thing. It's been studied now for 15 or 20 years. I first got involved in it, writing about it for Atlantic in 2005. At that time, the going question was about ideological polarization. And this was pretty easy to demonstrate. Here's the kind of data that we were looking at. Now, this is all the data I'm going to be showing you for the next few minutes is Pew data. This is, of course, much more recent than we had in 1995, but it was telling the story that we were already aware of. What we're looking at here is the ideological distribution of Democrats and Republicans. And as you can see, since 1994, both of these hills have moved much further apart. There's much less ideological overlap going on. This is the general public, and here's how it looks for the most politically engaged partisans. These are the thought leaders and the people who are most active in politics. And that is really very, very striking, the difference in those two shapes over a period of only a bit over 20 years. Now, all of that is familiar to you. The question that we were all asking in 2005 is, what's going on here? Is this individuals being radicalized so that their views are becoming more extreme and they're moving further apart? Or is this the parties sorting into 2 different groups so that increasingly all the liberals are on the Democratic side and all the conservatives are the Republican side? It's not the individuals, but it's like your sock drawer, which once mixed white and black socks in 2 different drawers, now having one drawer that's all black, one drawer that's all white, so they move apart. And the answer is it was clearly some of both, but the evidence suggests that in fact the public is, for the most part, not radicalizing. I'll be interested to hear what Carlin has to say in the discussion period, but this is over the same period of time. You can see that although the distribution has flattened a bit over the last few years, we don't see a bimodal pattern, and in fact, if anything, the public seems to have moved somewhat to the left. So that suggests that what's going on here is, to a large extent, sorting, not radicalization, at least not on ideological lines, a point in which we'll come back to. And here's something else which suggests the same thing. These are 6 lines which look at the values divide when you divide the public by 6 different classifications. And what you see here is that most of them are pretty stable. What we have here, race, gender, education, religion, age. They're polarizing a little bit, a few of them, but not very much. The 6th is partisanship. That's the top line, and that's an obvious story. The parties are much farther apart ideologically than they ever used to be. But what's interesting here is if we were seeing a polarization of an entire society, you would expect to see racial groups move further apart in ideology and values. You would expect to see genders. You would certainly expect to see it from education and religion when we really don't. What seems to be happening is that the public is dividing itself into opposed partisan camps, but not necessarily always two opposed ideological camps, at least not on lines other than partisanship. Well, the way we used to think about this, and certainly the way I did, is if what's happening is people are sorting themselves into two parties with two distinct ideologies, that might be a good thing, because you want to have distinct choices to the public. You get less mushy policy results. We might have better conversations. That does not seem to be what's happened, to put it mildly, and increasingly, scholars who look at this are having to think on quite a different dimension. They're having to reach deep into fields like social psychology to figure out what's going on here. Clearly, people are not getting along, and we're not negotiating across party lines, and increasingly we're looking at two factors to explain that. The first is what's sometimes called affective polarization. Many of you probably know that term. Here's one measure of it, again from Pew. People don't just disagree with each other at this point, they fear each other. These are the percentage of people viewing the other party as a threat to the nation's well-being. What you regard as a threat, you fear and hate. Now, this is a different kind of emotion than ideological disagreement. This is not about whether the capital gains tax should go up or down, or even about abortion. This is about, if I'm right, then the other side of this debate is a group that we cannot live with as a country. We must fear them. The second phenomenon is in some ways even stranger and more interesting. It was named negative partisanship by Alan Abramowitz, and here's a measure of it, again from Pew. It turns out that what seems to be motivating people is not that they like their own party, it's that they dislike the other party. You can see in the upper question here, when people are asked for motivations on why they feel the way they do, overwhelmingly, by almost 2-to-1, the motivation is the other party's policies are bad for society, not that my own parties are good for the country. More interesting, actually, to me, because it's so weird, is this second finding. Look at this. Have a lot in common with the other party, less than 20%, no surprise there. Have a lot in common with my own party, it's no higher. People don't feel they have any more in common with their own party than the other party, so what in the world can possibly be going on here? You would expect from these numbers to see a generalized sense of alienation. You'd expect to see people staying home and dropping their party identifications, and we do feel some of that, but that doesn't seem to be the result. So here's where, in order to explain this, we need to get into the deep realms of social psychology, and we need to go back to experiments that date from the 1930s and an earlier era. There's more of this in my article. I'm just going to give you headlines. A lot of you know all this already. Humans are a tribalistic species. We are designed to organize ourselves into groups. In the evolutionary environment, as Arnold has pointed out in some of his writing, ostracism essentially means death. So your top priority, or certainly one of them, is to avoid losing your identity, losing your place and status in your group, or as it's sometimes called, your tribe. And human cognition and reasoning seem to be organized to that end. Now, reasoning is also useful for figuring things out and getting right answers, but that appears not to be the reason it's there. It appears to be there so that we can justify to ourselves and others positions which will preserve and enhance our status in the group, win us allies to help us do things, win us social support, mating opportunities, and the like. We tend to think that the way cognition works is that information goes from our eyes to our brains, which process it, and then to our groups, where we discuss it. It actually looks more like the process goes from our eyes to the group, to what the people around us are thinking and seeing, or what we think they're thinking and seeing, and then to the brain. We then process it as a result. So this expresses itself in a lot of ways, but two are very substantial, and you're familiar with both of them. One is confirmation bias. We look for ways to confirm what we already believe, and we look for ways to express and think what will keep us in good standing with our tribe. And there's almost no limit to the lengths that we'll go in order to do that, including twisting the world cognitively. And the second is conformism bias, which adds to confirmation bias, which is that we try to conform with those around us. We don't do this consciously, though sometimes we do, but often we do it unconsciously, and we will tend to see what others see. Experiments dating back to the 1930s using optical illusions found that what people thought they were seeing and reported seeing depended on what people around them were seeing. People see individually actually different things than they see in groups. Strange, but true. So I think some of you recognize what was going on here. Raise your hand if you know what this is. My panel did. Does anyone recognize this? A few. This is an experiment conducted in 1951 by a psychologist named Solomon Asch. He took a group of people and he told them they were being given a vision test, and he showed them a card with the lines on them. This is designed to be obvious. It's just easy. And then he told them to do the same line matching exercise that you were told to do. And when they were told to do it individually by themselves, they got it right because it wasn't difficult. But here's the thing. He put them in groups of 8. And the first 7 were Confederates, or as I like to think of those of us on the stage, stooges. And they all picked the wrong answer. The actual experimental subject was the 8th person in the room who went last and was confronted with the first 7 all saying it's B. So what would you guess the 8th person does in that situation? Believe the evidence of their own eyes or go with the group? The answer is some of both, but 3/4 of subjects conform with the group on at least one trial, and 1/3 of them go along with the group a majority of trials. And some of them report that, well, they knew the answer and were just conforming, and others actually said they saw what the group saw. It doesn't matter all that much from a social point of view, because since we collect views from what we think other people think, that's based on what they're telling us. So if we hear everyone else say something, that will in many cases be just as contagious whether or not we believe it or not. That's how something like the Soviet Union comes about, where you have an emperor's new clothes phenomenon. Everyone knows the society is built on lies, but no one is saying it, so everyone is pretending it doesn't. It's an unstable situation, but it can be sustainable for a long time, and it can lead to terrible social mistakes. One famous example of that, raise your hand if you've heard of the Robbers Cave experiment. I think 1953. Also famous, you could not conduct this experiment today. To put it very briefly, a group of 22, 11, and 12-year-olds were divided. They were total strangers to each other. They were divided into 2 groups. I think they were called the Eagles and the, what was the other ones? Anyone remember? Anyway, two groups. They were placed in a public park, sort of a state park in Oklahoma, told nothing about each other. And then the 2 groups were allowed to bond for a while, and then they were allowed to encounter each other. And they very soon descended into a Lord of the Flies war situation where they were physically raiding each other, they were taunting each other, and after a while they began gathering rocks and sticks in order to attack each other, and the experiment had to be stopped. Now, these children were total strangers to each other. This was not a dispute about anything. This was a dispute organized around the fact that humans seem to need these in-group identities. And we will go to great lengths to protect those identities. And one of the ways we do that is by contrasting ourselves with an out-group. This is crude, but it helps me to think about it. If you want to think about identity in those terms, think about all of us painting our faces in garish colors, putting on some kind of elaborate headdress, going to the top of the hill with a spear and shaking our spear at the tribe on the other hill and shouting imprecations at them while they do the same thing to us. That seems to be some of what's going on here. Now, this raises a very peculiar proposition. Don't take this too literally. It's simplistic. But as a way to think about it, what if polarization is in fact not about anything? What if this is a phenomenon that's largely driven by humans' need to identify their own social group and contrast it with another social group? Well, we've long had many sources of identity in America, and they were things like where you lived, race, religion, of course, ideology was one of them, and the other kinds of groups you were involved in. it's increasingly looking as if many of those things have either broken down or they've been replaced by partisanship. Increasingly, people are identifying as members of a Republican group or a Democratic group, and in order to do that, they seem to engage in what psychologists call identity defense, or what's also been called emotional rescue, which is, so suppose I'm in a group and I'm not wowed about what this group stands for. In fact, I have reservations about it, but my identity and social standing depend on staying in good odor with this group. Well, what am I going to do to justify my identity with this group? I'm going to have to hate the other group even more. Now think about the perverse consequences for a minute. The more my own group burdens my ability to identify with it, you would think the answer to that would be, well, you'd break away from the group. You'd do something else. You'd consider the other group. You'd become an independent. It seems that what people do in that situation, in many cases, if they feel burdened by having to identify with their own group, is go to great lengths to hate the other side even more. So that means that no matter what my party does, I'm always going to find a way to see the other side as even worse. So this gets us into what I call the Hillary's email phenomenon. It doesn't matter what Donald Trump does. It doesn't matter how far he goes. No matter what he does, members of his tribe who identify with him and with his group will always find a way to dislike the Democrats even more. So I don't know if there's an end to this process or how far it goes, but it is clearly not a process that is going to be very consistent with traditional political processes like negotiation, bargaining, compromise, transaction, because the goal of the game here is to preserve your identity by disliking the other side. So now, difficult question. Ideology still matters. We're not throwing all of conventional political science out the window. Interest, values, the things that drive politics, money, of course. Do we know to what extent this new form of polarization today is about identity defense and to what extent it's about ideological defense? We don't, is the answer. But they are clearly interconnected. They seem to be feeding each other. And one interesting piece of research by Liliana Mason of University of Maryland, who does really first-rate empirical work, has looked at some data, and she figures that the ratio is about 2-to-1, that what's happening today is probably about 2/3 identity-driven and 1/3 ideology-driven. So that's interesting. We don't know that that's the right answer. We may never know. But we do know the results of this. There's some very perverse things. Sides flip altogether, depending on who's president or who's doing it. A good example of that, in 2013, I owe this to James Hohmann, who pointed this out in the Washington Post. In 2013, 22% of Republicans, less than a quarter, supported US missile strikes in response to Assad's use of chemical weapons in Syria. In 2017, 86% of Republicans supported Donald Trump's decision to launch strikes against Assad for exactly the same reason. It's a complete flip. No ideological consistency there, but complete psychological consistency. This is people doing what they need to do to stay with the team. And it turns out that's easy for humans to do. Hypocrisy is no obstacle. So now we start to hit the harder questions, which I hope we'll have time to discuss. One question is, what changed to unleash all of these forces now? So why people are as divided as they are is not, in fact, a very interesting question, because I think what we're seeing is actually what humans are wired to do, as we see in the Robbers Cave experiment. The interesting question is, why did these behaviors ever subside for as long as they did? And of course, they did reappear in the Civil War, for example, in the 1850s. I think that the reason they subsided, or a big part of it, is the development of a lot of social technologies over a long period of time that used a lot of different means to channel human psychology and behavior away from these strictly tribal channels and toward more impersonal channels. Those include market economies, the constitutional system, which forces compromise, science, which requires people to debate issues in a very impersonal way. It also, and here we get to a reason I'm especially glad to share this platform with Yuval Levin, It also has a lot to do, I believe, with the creation of a lot of social institutions that found ways to blend people and create affinities that were less tribal and less dangerous than the classic ones like religion and partisanship. And these would be, we all know what they are, they're everything from unions and clubs, the old-fashioned kinds of political parties, which were much more participatory and much less about tribe, and a lot of other social organizations, which allowed people to feel affinity in ways that were less socially disruptive. Well, what happened to weaken all those things? It's a very overdetermined question. So many things happened, it's surprising they're not a lot weaker than they are. We saw social sorting by party and geography and cultural affinities and news media, so people have less contact with each other. It becomes much easier to dehumanize each other. We see social media, which are basically designed to inspire impulsive expressions of outrage dedicated to displaying my own team's superiority to the other team in often anonymous formats. You could not design a better way to bring out tribal animosities than the design of social media. You have, of course, the many kinds of damage to many kinds of institutions like unions, civic clubs. I think the big one here is religion. Now, religion itself can be, as we all know, a very, very destructive form of tribalism, but religion is at least suited to conversations about ultimate meaning, purpose. Politics is not, but when we displace our identities from religious groups to political groups and look to politics for redemption in apocalyptic scenarios where if the other side wins, it's the end of the world, politics is simply not suited to bear that burden, and it tends to collapse. And then damage to civic norms, like compromise and forbearance, which Pete Wehner, who's in this room, has written so eloquently about. And finally, I like to point out that what's happened is not suicide or natural death, at least not entirely. It's also murder. It is the business model, and has been for some years, of any number of activists and media people and opportunists and demagogues to deliberately go about channeling these tribal feelings. And you can name names, actually. I'm going to name some conservative ones. For example, Roger Ailes, Newt Gingrich, Rush Limbaugh, and now Donald Trump. They're doing mighty well by exploiting these tendencies, which are darn easy to exploit. And of course, on the other side, you can look at what's happening on college campuses, where tribalism is being encouraged instead of being asked to transcend these identities and dissolving them to a larger sort of liberal arts education. We're seeing students being told to double down on them, and we're seeing the results of that on campus. Coping with it is what we're here to discuss. Since I'm out of time, I have the solution, but I've run out of time to tell you. I hate when that happens. But I'll tell you the general buckets of how to think about it, which is some of it is about social redesign. There's lots that can be done, I believe, to redesign social media products and platforms so that they are less antisocial, and the platforms are thinking about it. There's direct action. We're seeing a sprouting of civic groups across the country. I'm on the board of one of them. It's called Better Angels, which are actually working on a community basis to depolarize. We have technologies to depolarize as well as to polarize. Again, not easy, but a lot of people are working on it and thinking about it. We're not helpless in this situation. I think it would help to strengthen political parties vis-a-vis the radical activists and the polarizing interest groups who increasingly run things like the Democratic primaries. And I think the biggest thing of all, the largest bucket, is the one that Yuval Levin is pioneering and has a very, very important book coming out about, and I think January, is it? And that's to begin seeing our social institutions and understanding that to the extent that we weaken them, we also weaken the ability of our society to form trust across tribal lines. And that means looking for all kinds of ways to begin rebuilding and strengthening this middle layer of social institutions which we have so neglected for the last 40 or 50 years. Thank you all.
So I have a logistical question. Is it okay if I pace the floor, or should I be tied to the podium?
I think it's okay. If no one's having a heart attack in the back, I think we'll do
okay, all right. And you never know what you're doing to the camera people, but I'm a natural pacer. I like to distract people with weird motions and leaning in one direction, another, and so on. since I get to speak second, I want to quarrel with or quibble with a couple of Jonathan's points. One is, he listed only conservatives who've profited from polarization, and I always include Rush Limbaugh, but I equivalently include Paul Krugman. I mean, he conducts himself in a way he would never conduct himself in an economic seminar in his column, and he's been doing it for years, and obviously been very successful as a result. The other quibble is I think we're farther from a solution than what Jonathan suggested. And I'll actually say more about that at the end of my talk. Okay, so for several years, I've been wrestling with a series of questions about political discourse and political culture. So the first question I asked was how? How is it that when someone on our side makes a point, and it seems to us very compelling, very devastating to the other side, it just bounces off the other side? And so that leads you to think about language, that people must be talking different languages. And so 7 years ago, I wrote this extended essay called The Three Languages of Politics. And I'll just give you two of the languages, the progressive language and the conservative language. What I claim is that the progressive language focuses on oppressor versus oppressed. There are certain groups that are historically oppressed, there are other groups that are oppressors, and if a progressive can see an issue framed in those terms, that there's an oppressor and an oppressed, then if you disagree with a progressive, they will, in their minds, see you as being on the side of oppressors. For conservatives, the equivalent is civilization versus barbarism. Civilization is this precious, fragile thing, and if it were to break down, we would revert to barbarism. And when they can frame an issue in those terms, they will see those who disagree with them as on the side of barbarism. So they're sort of languages of demonization in some sense. So let me just give one example of an issue where you can see the different framings and how they play out. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's easy for a progressive to frame that as, well, there's an oppressed group, the Palestinians, there's an oppressor group, the Israelis, and so if you're on the side of the Israelis, then you're on the side of oppression. For a conservative, it's easy to frame the issue as Israelis share our civilized values. A lot of the Palestinian groups don't. So if you're on the side of the Palestinians, you're on the side of barbarism. So that's the how story. The next question that raises is why? Why don't people talk the same language? Why do they use these different languages that serve the purpose of demonization rather than persuasion? And that took me into political psychology and just a lot of the stuff that Jonathan just walked you through. In fact, the second edition of the Three Languages of Politics really beefed up a lot of this political psychology. So I won't repeat any of that since we just heard much of it here. The next question that leads to is, and Jonathan raised this question of sort of, well, why have things gotten worse apparently over the last 15 years? Because human psychology hasn't changed in the last 15 years. And so that leads you to think about cultural trends. And Jonathan again mentioned both of the trends that come to mind. One trend is the segmentation of society, or the separation of society, what Charles Murray calls coming apart, what Bill Bishop calls the big sort. We have fewer meaningful relationships these days with people who have different educational backgrounds, different economic circumstances, and different political affiliations. And so that's a cultural trend that's changed. And the other one being the growth of the internet in general and social media in particular. But I have a somewhat different take than a lot of people do about what the internet and social media are doing. A lot of people think of it as in terms of the bad actors, that they've enabled extremists and liars and foreign agents. I think that it's more, we have met the enemy and he is us. I take almost a McLuhan-esque view of what social media are doing. And one of the things that they're doing is they've jumbled the relationship between our intimate world and our remote world. So when I was growing up, the intimate world was your family, your friends, your neighbors, and they were the people that were in your mind, in your awareness most of the time, and they were also physically present. And the remote world was the world of extremists, politicians, celebrities, and you read about them in newspapers, you watched them on television, but a lot of the time they were out of sight, out of mind. Now they're all on the same screen in your pocket. You can be looking at a picture of your friend eating at a restaurant, flip your finger, and you're looking at a confrontation between two extremist groups in a demonstration. So the remote world and the intimate world have been jumbled together, and I think they're incommensurate with one another. The intimate world is a world of small groups where you can deal with people informally. You don't need market prices, bureaucracies, organization charts, you don't need written rules. You don't need the formal devices that we use in a large-scale society. I think there's a real phase change that takes place between small groups and large-scale society. Sort of like when you boil water, you get a phase change. The properties of steam are very different than the properties of liquid water. And I think the equivalent boiling point in social groups is maybe about 150 people, the Dunbar number, where if you're well below that, informal processes and relationships work. Above that, you need the more formal devices, the organization charts or the market prices and what have you. So what social media has done by putting the intimate world and the remote world on the same screen and creating that confusion is, I think that it's sort of made people feel as intensely remote political events as they used to feel intensely about things that went on in their families and so on. And it's also, I think, added to a general tendency for people to not appreciate the sorts of systems and formal processes that are used to mediate society. So I think it just causes a lot of psychological and cultural problems, some of which I might not even be able to articulate, that I think contribute to the problem. So there's this third question of sort of why have things gotten worse apparently over the last 15 years. The next question is sort of, well, are things really so bad? Is our political strife so much worse than it's been in the past? And one standard of comparison is the 1960s. And I'm going to make a claim, and you may think I'm romanticizing the 60s, that things are worse now than they were in the 60s. In a way, Jonathan supported that claim with something I hadn't thought of by talking about how this negative partisanship has increased. What I was going to say is that the 1960s, first of all, the hippies and the straights were not separated by zip codes. And hippies had friends who were straights, straights had friends who were hippies, and in the end, the hippies reintegrated into mainstream culture, and mainstream culture integrated a lot of hippie ideas into mainstream culture. In fact, if you're one of those people who thinks that everything went wrong starting in the 60s, it's probably because you don't like what mainstream culture did in terms of adopting so many of the hippie ideas. But we came out of that without these, people didn't end up just retreating to their own zip codes and hating each other. And I'll also make a claim, and you really think I'm romanticizing the 60s when I say this, that the 60s, the young radicals were trying to open up possibilities. They were trying to take some sacred beliefs and make them contestable. Two examples. One sacred belief as of early 1960s was it would be a horrible thing if we let another country go communist. And, that's how we get into Vietnam. And that becomes contestable. First, there are teach-ins, and the young radicals made that contestable, and a lot of people changed their minds ultimately. Another example, homosexuality. As of 1960, it was a sacred belief that if you were homosexual, there was something wrong with you. The secular version of that was psychoanalytic theory. Eventually, that belief becomes contestable, and a lot of people change their minds about that. And so again, my claim is that a lot of the impetus in the 60s was taking sacred beliefs, making them contestable, opening minds. There's a book by Bruce Benson, I think it is, on sort of how to have productive conversations. And he says that you can have voices in your head, different voices in your head when you're having an argument. And sort of the most unconstructive voice in your head is the voice of power. I've got to get my way. You either finish your broccoli or you don't get dessert. That's the voice of power. The most constructive voice is the voice of possibility. And I think a difference between the 1960s and now is that somehow, even as ugly and confrontational as the 60s were, there was sort of the voice of possibility that was speaking in people's minds, not the voice of power. But if you look at the young radicals today, it's the voice of power. It's, if you disagree with me, you're a heretic and you need to be punished. And that's, so that's, part of the reason why I think this is a more dangerous, difficult period than the 60s. So the final question is, well, how do we heal things? And as preliminary to that, let me give you a thought experiment. Imagine I handed a Post-it note to everyone in this room, and I said, on your Post-it note, write down what you think is the essential feature, the essential problem that we have with our political culture today. And then we took those Post-it notes and put them up here. We eliminated any duplicates, but we also allowed people to say, oh, well, there's something else I thought of. Could you put that down? My conjecture is we would end up with more Post-it notes than there are people in this room, which is an indication of the complexity of the problem. And so that leads me to some do's and don'ts that I would suggest about this. The first don't is don't assume that something that works in a small group represents a solution that can scale up to a large group. Again, there's this phase change between a small group and society. And another don't is don't assume that a regulation that tackles one aspect of the problem is going to not have unintended consequences that could come back to haunt you. Jonathan has written eloquently about how many of the reforms that were political reforms that have been enacted over recent decades weakened institutions that we now wish were stronger. And so that would be another don't. For a do, I would say do try to, and this would be a challenge because with all those Post-it notes up there, the problem is very complex. We probably can't even sort them into separate categories because they feed back on each other in many ways. But try to come up with a vision and have in your back of your mind a working vision of what a healthier political culture would look like. And what I'm sort of afraid of is that deep down, what a lot of us are thinking is a healthier political culture is one where my side wins. Coming up with a sort of a more reasonable picture of a healthier political culture is important. And then my final do is sort of relates is respect the complexity of the problem. This is what some people term, a wicked problem, a problem where you don't even have a good description of the problem. You're like the blind man and the elephant, and that means that you don't necessarily have a solution. Maybe there is no solution. So that's so if there's one thing that when someone asks you, what did you hear today from this guy Kling, you can say, respect the complexity of the problem.
Yuval, could I clean up one loose end?
Please.
It will take only a moment. I'm sorry, I meant to do this for you all. Some of you may be wondering, oops, where did my slides go? So let's see if we can get them up here. No, first slide's gone. Well, maybe I can't clean up my loose end. Anyway, the top diagram, which was a horizontal line, was in fact, well, you can see it there on the side. That was in fact an optical illusion, and the correct answer was that the two segments are in fact the same. I know that you were all dying to know that. There we are. The correct answer down below is C. It is, in fact, not an optical illusion. What I was trying to do was create a situation mirroring the Asch conformity experiment in which you might listen to these two gentlemen when they said it was B and think, well, they must know something I don't. So I'm going with B despite the evidence in my own eyes. And I set you up for that. I cheated. I said this is an optical illusion. It's not. The top one, however, is an optical illusion. And that's how I was trying to fool you. A and B are the same length. Right. Thanks for indulging me, Yuval.
Thanks, Jonathan. We all feel better.
Yeah, I know you were wondering.
And thank you both for very, very rich presentations that leave us a lot to talk about. I guess I would start by wondering with you about whether there are ways of addressing this problem that are themselves indigenous to the 21st century, rather than ways of addressing it being exclusively ways of looking back to what has been lost over time and thinking about how we might recreate the political culture of the middle of the 20th century, which was unusual in a lot of ways. Arnold, is there anything good about the internet, about what's happened to our civic culture, our society in the last 30 years that we can draw on, we can build on in trying to address these problems?
Boy, you hit me with a tough question.
Better you than me.
Just saw some advice, like if you can't answer the question, come up with a different question that you can answer. I guess the first thought I have is that part of the vision for the future has to be to resolve the conflict between elitists and populists, as it were. I think that's, we've had turnover in elites in the past. Now it's just, and when we talk about the conflict between elites and populists, part of your vision for the future, you have to decide, how do you want to see that resolved? Do you want populist victory? I mean, personally, I think that's actually not a good plan. Do you want elitist victory? That's not such a good plan either. Do you want some turnover of elites? I think that's what you sort of hope for, is that, a different type of elites. And what I hope for is kind of more humility on both sides, where, populists don't think they're absolutely right and the elites are, are totally illegitimate. And elites don't think they know everything and know how to run everything, and that they can't be questioned, which is kind of their, they've really, thrown up their defenses. That doesn't answer your question, but that's kind of what comes to mind.
John, is there anything we can be glad we have that we didn't have a generation ago?
It's not the way I think about you, Yuval, though I will be looking to your book for an answer to that. I know you.
Good luck.
Well, you're doing the best thinking out there on this, but it's not the way I think about it. I think of this as a constant race. We are, despite our neckties and blouses and cell phones, we are the same creatures fundamentally that we were 100,000 years ago roaming the Serengeti in small tribes. And the constant contest is, as technologies come up with ways to discombobulate us, to figure out ways to readapt institutions in order to keep up with that. And it's always a contest. I don't know that it's new or old. I think the fundamentals here are timeless. What we're seeing on social media, as you're well aware, is not the first major disruption of this kind. There was a much bigger one in the late 15th century with the invention of the printing press, which set off 200 years of violence on an epic scale, and also set off the long, slow process of building liberalism, which was a way of coping all that. It was a set of social technologies. Well, here we are again. So yeah, I'm sure there's lots of potential in these technologies to address these problems, but it's always going to be a process of chasing. I've been exploring a little bit some of social media companies thinking about this. Twitter, for example, is well aware of the problems with their platform. Their head, Jack Dorsey gave an interview not long ago where he discusses this and says he thinks the answers are going to have less to do with the policies of the platform, hate speech, content moderation, that sort of thing, than they will with the design of the product. And I think that's right. I think these products were designed in a terrible way for human interaction, but there are ways to design them better. I myself, for example, have proposed Twitter should have a feature that once you set it, you can't post right away. You have to wait an hour, and then it reads your post back to you and says, are you sure you want to have this out there on the internet forever? Or you could send it to your group of personal editors. My posts would routinely go to Arnold and Yuval, and they would have a chance to look at them and let me know if I was about to get in trouble before I posted it. So there are lots of ways to re-engineer institutions to keep up, but I don't think it's old versus new.
Mm-hmm. Does the focus on Twitter, for example, maybe even on social media in particular, but especially Twitter, which is much smaller than some others, does that suggest that this is above all an elite problem, that we have here a kind of distortion of elite institutions and elite behaviors that seems to be pouring acid on our political system? Or would this conversation make sense to the vast majority of voters? Is it even a problem they think is a problem?
Do you have Jay Carney's phone number? He's in the building. We should ask him because he's gone out and done that. My impression of the research, Arnold, you may know this better than I, is that this is a heavily elite-driven process, though it's not exclusively elite, that lots of people are taking their cues from elites, the people we see on TV, the people who sort of frame opinion about parties. So it's not only among elites, but it is influenced by elites, and that actually gives me hope, because elites could also be part of the process of solving it, and I'm hoping you're an example of that.
Well, I always, these discussions, I never go without citing Martin Gurry and his Revolt of the Public, and this is really, I think even Martin Gurry would have said that the Revolt of the Public, had reached a peak in 2016, and then this year, there's so many countries where there are popular demonstrations against governments that I just don't think you can say, well, this is just the elites. I mean, there's just this the public, the mass publics are revolting in countries all around the world, and that's, as I say, the question of how the elite populist conflict plays out is just a very important question in any vision
Yeah, we find with
how
Better
things work.
Angels, which brings people together in sessions not designed to change anyone's mind, but to help blues and reds figure out how to connect and talk to each other, is that people are consistently surprised that they have more in common than they thought.
Mm-hmm. Arnold, you ended by saying we should imagine a healthy political culture. What does that look like for you?
Well, my post-it note of sort of what the essential problem would have said lack of humility. And so to me, the healthier political culture is one where people aren't sure they're right, and in terms of this negative partisanship, aren't sure that the other side is wrong and evil.
Yeah, I associate the word forbearance with a healthy political culture. And that's where everyone disagrees and knows they disagree, but no one is trying to wipe out the other side. And that's where your suggestion of Paul Krugman's an interesting one. And believe me, I tried to get left-wing equivalents of Roger Ailes and Newt Gingrich, so I'm glad to have a candidate. But Gingrich has explicitly said, I'm not sure, maybe Krugman has, I'd like to know that. Gingrich has explicitly said this is a war and only one side can win. There's only room for one side victory in this country. And Trump certainly implies that. And that, to me, is what crosses the line into a different kind of political space. I'm not sure, has Krugman said that?
Well,
He said there's no room for conservatives in this country?
It's what I predict for every Paul Krugman column is it will be, I know what the real motives of conservatives are, and they're bad. And so the implication is that, yeah, you do need to get rid of them. Just as Rush Limbaugh's implication is, every radio program is, I know what the real motives of liberals are, and they're bad. And that's actually one of the psychological phenomena of, believing that you know your opponent's true motives better than they do, that I included in my book.
Yeah, interesting. Here's a practical test. Imagine a country in which Republicans controlled every branch. Well, they controlled the Senate and the presidency, which we have now. And imagine a country where, despite having that control, presidents still defer to senators of the other state, of the other party, in making judicial appointments, as they traditionally did for years. They didn't have to, but they did. If Barbara Mikulski in Maryland said, I can't live with a nominee, then a Republican president wouldn't put him or her on the court. Well, to me, that was a good sign that both sides were retreating from the use of the ultimate weapons and the use of power nakedly.
Mm-hmm. So the change that needs to happen is an attitudinal change by people at the top of these kinds of institutions?
No, I think it's also institutional design. And I'm not sure what the answers look like. I'm looking to your book on that. But no, it can't be just attitudes. The Constitution is a framework designed to force compromise on people who don't want to compromise. And it goes to great lengths to do that. And increasingly, people are finding ways around that. What's been called constitutional hardball by political scientists. And institutional designs are going to have to adapt to that.
Well, we've got a group of people in this room who have given a lot of thought to these questions over a long period of time, and I want to draw them into this conversation too. I only ask that you tell us who you are and try to make your question as much like a question as you possibly can. And we do have a microphone going around the room. Let's start over here in the corner.
Hi, I'm Luke Phillips. I work with Better Angels, and I appreciate the thoughts here. I just want to throw a devil's advocacy argument in here. Sam Rosenfeld has written at length suggesting that the kind of mid-20th century parties where there were Southern reactionary wings in the Democratic Party and Western and Northeastern progressive wings in the Republican Party, in which the parties were not polarized, was inferior to the polarized party system of today. And so he's basically suggesting on that front, as I read it, that there are there's a different set of downsides to non-polarized parties than to polarized parties. I know that's different from some of the things that were discussed here, but I was wondering if you could talk about some of the potential downsides that you might see with this depolarized work as well, too.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, if you look at mid-20th century political science, it is all about how terrible it is that we don't have partisanship. And raises arguments that strike us now as coming from another planet, but that were a serious problem, not presenting voters with enough options and choices, not having parties that are responsible for the policies that they undertake. Are we missing the upside of division and partisanship now?
There's a distinction to make here. When the famous report that you were alluding to, I think, Luke, you're aware of this report, American Political Science Association, called for parties that were more clearly divided along ideological lines. What they had in mind were parties that were about policies that were coherent, and parties that were capable, had the institutional capacity and will to build policy agendas in a coherent way and present them to the public. What they were not talking about was a situation where parties, in fact, become much weaker organizationally, but become tribal brands. So they don't actually necessarily stand for anything. We see that when the Republican Party goes from being the party of Paul Ryan or the Tea Party to the party of Donald Trump and Stephen Miller. This is not what anyone had in mind. This is a different category of problem. And I would argue you set the ideological structure to one side because tribalism is superimposed on top of it. It complicates everything else by creating this level of animosity and friction. So we shouldn't be thinking of it as a political arrangement. We should be thinking of it as a kind of environmental problem.
Arnold?
What he said.
Very good. Over here in the Phil Wallach.
Hi, Phil Wallach from R Street Institute. I'm interested in Yuval's preamble where we talked about we sort of have a policy-free political discussion, and a lot of Jonathan's article sort of echoes that in saying, you know, maybe this polarization is about nothing. I guess my question is, what happened to the strong policy demands? Where are they going in the system? Are they absent because something about the citizens of the 2010s means that they literally just find themselves unable to formulate strong policy demands, or are there latent demands out there that are not being met? And if that's the case, why isn't it to one political party's immense advantage to figure out a way to cater to those demands? We're stuck in a period of this close contest between the two parties. Presumably, if one of them could find a way to sell itself as the true champions of what the people really want, it may have a period of electoral dominance in the future. It has strong incentives to do that. So I guess my question is the fact that we don't see these strong policy demands coming through to the sort of top line, headline political discourse, is that likely to be a temporary failure, or is there actually something that's changed about the whole electorate that means that we're just sort of stuck?
Well, I would, if I'd give the Martin Gurry answer, that the new media have created an environment that has undermined the legitimacy of elites and raised the efficacy of the public. And the public knows how to protest, it knows how to negate, it does not know how to form a coherent agenda. So there's no coherent agenda for the parties to appeal to. All they're doing is reacting to this negation.
Phil, that is a brilliantly framed question to which I don't have the answer. It deserves a book or an article, which I would volunteer you to write.
Yes, I can think of a place to publish it too, so go ahead.
Yeah, we're all for it. It's an empirical question to which I don't have the answer, but the way I would think about approaching it if I were writing it is Bill Schneider, the Harvard political scientist, has a formulation that politics is about values and interest, and it used to be interest trumped values, and at the end of the day, farmers would vote based on, crop subsidies rather than abortion. And he said what changed in the Reagan years and beyond is values trumped interest. People started voting based on things like abortion and homosexuality. and whose side you're on in values. And there is a question, not an answer, but a question raised by the evidence I'm looking at and that we're all seeing, which is whether now both of those things are now trumped by identity. And what you're asking is this new thing superseding the others, or is it just temporarily masking them? I don't know the answer to that. But I think we should at least consider the hypothesis that the inability of traditional organizations, institutions like religious organizations, to channel the need for identity has dumped that into politics and maybe shifted politics to a place where identity is now the primary subject of American politics. I don't know, but it seems to me to be possible. What do you think?
One thing I would add to that, Phil, is that if you spend a lot of time with politicians now, as I know you do, they are oddly confused about what voters want. And it is a debilitating kind of confusion. So that it seems to me that translating voter pressure into policy demands is actually the work of people in and around the political system, right? That pressure doesn't arise as policy demands from the public, but there are people throughout the system who take the kinds of concerns voters seem to have and turn them into arguments for public policy ideas. It's what some of the people here do. It's what some people in Congress do. And that's become very, very hard to do in recent years because the political system just keeps saying, the electorate in some ways just keeps saying, no, that's not what we care about.
And look what's happening around the world. Look at the public supported Macron. Now they're revolting against him. In Italy, they put into this completely opposite parties in a coalition. In Israel, they can't vote for a government.
Yeah.
I mean, it just...
Britain too, in some ways.
Yeah.
I would say for contemporary American politicians, especially on the right, 2016 was just unbelievably confusing. And the members of the House who were elected by kind of Tea Party forces, who then saw their voters become the first Trump voters, even though what Trump was saying seemed to be the opposite of what they had said to their voters, if you think in issue terms, about trade, about spending, they didn't and still don't know what to do with that. And it turns out that what their voters liked about what they said had much more to do with the tone than with the substance, which makes it because in tone they are similar to Trump, it makes it very hard for them to know what the substance ought to be. And for the time being, that seems to mean there is no substance.
I'm haunted to this day by a quotation from a discombobulated Republican politician in the 2016 campaign period when we were all trying to figure out what the heck was going on. And this person said, half of these people, meaning the voters, half of these people don't even know why they're angry.
Let's take another question. Yeah, back here.
Thank you. Enjoyed the presentation. Name is Michael Berenson. There seem to be a number of issues in this country, immigration seems to be one, where if you chopped off the 20% most liberal, 20% most conservative, that remaining group could come to a consensus that would be better than the status quo, and yet it doesn't happen. Now, is some of that the tribalism you described, that, better that my party not lose or that the other party not win? Or what is it, and what do you think it is? And I guess importantly, can we get people to focus on the national interest rather than their tribe's interest?
I'm going to say that, I think it's absolutely the tribalism, the things that Jonathan talked about, that, any attempt to bring about a consensus on immigration would result in people saying, well, my side lost. We let the other side win. And so these people would get primaried out. And that goes back to sort of the big sort of people, in congressmen in congressional districts where their biggest fear for getting reelection is a primary campaign, not a general election. So there's that structural problem, but there's this basic, tribalism. I think immigration is like a classic example of a problem that is solvable in the absence of the tribal hatred.
I agree with that with a modification, which is I return us momentarily to the hard question I asked. The one that fascinates me is why has this extreme identity politics not always happened? We must have been doing something differently because humans haven't changed. And that's where I start thinking at the mechanical level about the processes that were used to buffer the political system from the kinds of shocks, disruptions that identity politics will create. If you look in the current issue of The Atlantic, you'll see an article by me and Ray LaRaja. Something I think a lot about is if I could change only one thing. It's a very complicated, you're exactly right, Arnold. We've got to respect the complexity of this problem. But if you pushed me against the wall and said, change one thing, it would be the candidate selection process ought to be returned, that there should be a larger role for professionals in that process. Professional politicians have to be there year after year. They have to live with the other side. They have to pass the appropriations bills and keep the government open. They have to worry about the reputation of their parties. They're paid to do that. Voters are not, and especially not the interest groups who are not representative voters, who in fact dominate the primaries and turn them into contests over purity and tribalism. So the place I would begin, if I was beginning one, would be a stronger method of peer review and professional input in selecting candidates to reduce the role of the extremists and the tribes. That could be done in both parties to a large extent without any change in law at all. It just requires a different way of thinking about politics and especially a kind of institutional self-confidence which our parties have lost. But it is not mechanically difficult.
Take another question back here.
Kurt Couchman with the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, although this is my own question. Throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries, government has centralized, and that's been aided in large part by communications technology. Now that communications technology is essentially anti-central, does that mean that one way of potentially addressing some of these problems might be to decentralize functions of government or some of the powers, not necessarily from DC to the states, but perhaps also from the executive branch to Congress or from congressional leadership to rank and file members?
That was made for you because you wrote a book about.
Well, yeah, I think that it has to be part of the answer, but the challenge we face is that the people who would receive that power don't want it. And so for all of us who make the case for decentralization, especially within the federal system, the big challenge is that it would be great if we could count on Congress to do more of its actual job. The reason it doesn't is because its members choose not to, and would rather assign those powers elsewhere, so that for all that there's now a kind of enlivened talk about non-delegation, which I think would be great to revive non-delegation as a judicial doctrine, at the end of the day, if Congress doesn't want to do it and assigns it to an agency, there's not much to be done. Some of this is also the case within the system of federalism, where, I will tell you, having pushed for an alternative to Obamacare for years that would have put much more power in the hands of the states, the people who hated that idea most were governors and state legislators, who then would have been stuck trying to solve this problem. And so at some level, there needs to be someone who says that they are the insider, they are responsible, and they're going to take this on. And the problem we face over and over is that everybody wants to be the outsider who complains about the system rather than taking any responsibility.
Going back to your question about what technology or culture might enable in the future, it's possible that we could have a very different type of decentralization where you could imagine people having virtual governments where my policies aren't set by the People's Republic of Montgomery County, Maryland, but they're set somewhere else where they're more conducive to me. That's a sort of a science fiction story, a very, very different thing. But that's and I don't know the process of getting from here to there doesn't look easy. But if you allow me 200 years, as we did with the Enlightenment, maybe we get there.
I'll just footnote, I would, to some extent, disagree with the premise about the decentralizing nature of these technologies, and I give you Facebook, fantastically larger and more centralized than any media entity I think we've ever seen. Google is in the same league. What we're seeing actually, and think about China and what it's been able to do with these technologies. So I think Internet 2.0 is turning out to be a very different kind of bargain than many of us thought it would be.
Yeah.
Well, we are unfortunately at our time, so thank you both very much, and thank all of you for being here. It was an important conversation.
Thanks, Ron.